name is Daniel Munich, and I welcome you at another in line of public seminars organized by IDEA, a think tank, academic think tank at CERGE-EI with the help of Academy of Science Strategy 21. It's a great honor to have here today Professor Ludger Woessmann from Germany. I will give him most of the time today and to you at the end, but I will introduce him. I decided, since it's about education and his work is a lot about education, that my introduction will be educational, a little bit. I have to change the presentation. Yes. So, those who are regular visitors of our seminars remember we had several related seminars already. These are the older poster there, and we are missing one piece, which is today's seminar to fill the gap. Professor Woessmann from Germany is Professor of Economics at the University of Munich and Director of IFO Center for Economics of Education at the IFO Institute. His main research interests are determinants of long-term prosperity and student achievements and special role of education in all that. His further interests cover topics in history, economics of religion, and internet. So it's not only education, and if you browse his publications, you will find the studies on the impact of internet and history too. His work was rewarded by many prizes I will not list here, but as I promised, there will be some education in my introduction. So, first, he works at the joint workplace, which I will describe in detail because it was a little bit difficult for me. But those who want to download the information from web or from the PowerPoint presentation have here the IFO Institute and the CES information. Like VR joint workplace, this looks like a similar collaboration. I can't say much about his publications because they speak for themselves. He has 60 Web of Science articles or publications, but plenty of additional publications in terms of books and chapters and so on. He is publishing in best economic journals, which are listed there. Those who are interested can find it there later. He is co-editor, and I'm saying that because these are the resources for you who are more interested in economics of education, that you can find much more in those resources. So he is co-editor of very famous and unique textbook of economics of education with Eric Hanušek, who was here a year ago. There are several volumes of this book available in our CERGE-EI library too. He is co-organizer of very important European academic conference on economics of education every year in September. The bad side of that is that it's very difficult to get there because it's highly demanded, that it's really top conference. On the other hand, all the materials presented there, all the papers, are available for download from all past years from the website. So I strongly recommend those who are interested in economics of education issues that go there and look at those various issues which are being studied by modern economics. What else? Coordination of European expert network on the economics of education. Another important source of information Professor Woessmann is in charge of. He's coordinating this network of experts who are advising to the European Commission and policymakers across Europe and beyond Europe. If you go to the website, you will find that there are many very detailed studies and surveys summarizing the scientific information for, I would say, for general public and policymakers. So very useful source of information for interested audience. And finally, Ludger is involved in the policy debate in Germany, not only in Europe but also in Germany. And because Germany is close and they are discussing very similar topics as we are discussing here in Czech Republic, I'm sure at the end you will have a number of questions we are debating here to get his opinion from the German point of view. So that's it. That's the educational introduction. And I will give floor to Professor Woessmann to tell you about Knowlege Capital of Nations in 45 minutes or 60 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Okay, let me try to use this. Thank you very much for the kind words, Daniel. Thank you all for coming, for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to do this. Let me try to handle this. What I want to talk about today is really kind of one of the fundamental questions that I as an economist can think of, and I guess that most economists would like to understand, and this is basically why do some countries grow pretty fast in terms of the prosperity of their population and why have others stagnated, and does this have anything to do with education? And that's basically the topic of research that I've been doing together with Eric Henjushek, who should be credited for basically everything I'm saying here as well, for more than 10 years now, and finally we actually put all this together as well in a book that came out last year that is called the Knowlege Capital of Nations, and you'll see very soon what exactly we mean by that. That has been published at MIT Press, so if anything like that I'm talking here goes too quickly, you want to get more details on stuff, please get hold of the book and read the further details there. But let me directly jump into what I'm going to talk about. It kind of follows, like gives an overview of most of the topics that are covered in the book. But let me start by motivating this whole talk by trying to get everybody to try to step back 50 years or even more. Think of the early 1960s, like sometimes after the war, things have been settled a little bit. And the question now is, which regions of the world at that time would you have expected to really like fly off economically for the next 50 years, and which regions would you have expected to stagnate? Which are going to be the economic success regions, which are going to be the laggards? Of course, it's very hard to step back like that because like we know what happened since, and so we cannot avoid that. But if you would go down there, read some of the discussions around the time, or look at the data that is available, here's what it may be looking like. So here's just what GDP per capita looked like in 1960 and what the average years of schooling of the population in the different areas looked like. This is not the average of all the countries in there. It's basically an average for a total of some 50 countries that have specific data, or also that have basically ever participated in student achievement tests in an international perspective. We're going to talk much more about that in a minute. But if you would do it for like the whole countries in the regions, the ranking and the overall picture would look exactly the same. So here you have Asian countries, which literally here in this sense means East Asian countries in East Asia. You've got Sub-Saharan Africa, you've got the Middle East and North Africa region, Latin America, Europe, and well, the final group that I'll just call Commonwealth OECD, because it's basically like the residual, but they fit together pretty nicely. It's basically the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand put together as one group. So here you've got some world regions. And if you look at the GDP per capita, Latin America was actually looking pretty good at the time. It really wasn't that far off of Europe. There were several countries that, like Argentina at the time, that were actually very close to the poorer countries in Europe. much ahead of the African countries, and actually the East Asian countries were even lagging behind Sub-Saharan Africa at the time. And if you look at the years of schooling of the population, in the sense that if we think that the education of the population is something that may be relevant for the economy, and that's basically going to be the topic of my whole talk, what you basically see is that Latin America was doing pretty well there. I mean, they had substantially higher average school attainment than Asia. Asia was a little bit better than Sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region. But again, Latin America looked to be set out there to be like a region in the world that really would be pulling off now. It's already pretty okay. It has reasonable human capital. It was really set to maybe catch up to Europe, certainly much more than Asia at the time. Well, we all know that this is not what happened. What happened is the following. Let's look at the economic growth for the next 40 years. So let me just so most of what I'm going to show you, I will stop in the year 2000. But if we would do the same thing until, well, most of the data is probably available to 2011 or 2012, things would look exactly the same. The point is that we, when working on this, like we could have gone to 2007, 2008, 2009. The problem is, there you've got the big financial crisis, like a huge short-term shock to the economies in the world. And if you want to look at long-term perspectives, you don't want to be like hit by these short-term shocks that may actually point a very like disturbing, disturbed picture of the long-run perspectives. And also many people have argued that before the crisis, like bubbles build up, and so actually some of the growth that you've seen there may actually not have been very real, so you rather want to stop somewhat earlier, so we basically just stop in 2000. I think I'm going to show you one or two pictures that will persuade you that the same thing, but it looks the same if you go longer. Okay, if you go for 40 years of growth, basically what has happened is what you may be pretty much aware of, is that Asia was really the region in the world that kept growing and growing and growing by an average annual rate in terms of GDP per capita in this group of countries by 4.5%, whereas actually Latin America grew only by 1.8%, even less Sub-Saharan Africa by 1.4%, which means that 40 years later, GDP per capita in Asia was much higher than in Latin America. Like if you would go till today, it's true actually that 1960 on average, people in Latin America were twice as prosperous than people in Asia, whereas by today it's exactly the other way around. And these are the big things that you want to understand. If you want to know how economies work, you want to understand how the hell can it be that there's one region in the world that used to be like twice as rich at the beginning and by the end is actually only half as rich as the other region. If we understand that, we will better understand what is really at the core of long-run economic development. I mean, even more disturbing in Sub-Saharan Africa, which basically stayed there at the bottom and was like Asia, like really totally went away from them. Now, does this mean that the education of the population is really totally irrelevant for economic growth in the end? I mean, look at this. It was actually the case that Latin America had higher education than Asia at the beginning. That was kind of the perspective of research some 10 years ago, I guess, or 15 years ago, when several people have started to look into that and said, like, but wait a minute, the one thing we know is that probably like 1 year of schooling, say in Papua New Guinea, is probably not exactly the same than 1 year of schooling in Japan or in the United States or what have you. So in the end, like basically if you just look at the years of schooling of the population, you assume that 1 year of schooling gives you the same knowledge and skills for the population that are economically relevant in one country than in the other. And that just can't be true. But in the end, it's of course not how long you spend in the schools, but what you actually learn that should be economically relevant. And so one idea we had then to how to get closer to this basic idea is, let's look at direct tests of what people actually have learned. And so what we basically did is we went into the international student achievement tests and These have been done actually since the mid-1960s, and we can try to put all of these together from the early 60s to the 2000s, and try to build one measure of the average achievement of the population in the different countries in terms of their math and science skills, like what they actually know. I'll talk much more about that in a minute. Of course, that's core of what we are doing. But the basic idea is to measure what people actually know, so what we like to call the knowledge capital of each country, rather than just how long they stayed in school. And what came out there is really revealing. So this is an average test score. I don't know, maybe many of you will know the PISA test, which is this international student achievement test in math and science that the OECD has been doing since the year 2000. This is really put on this PISA scale, which has an average of the OECD countries of 500. And then you can basically see how people in the different countries have performed. And here, you all of a sudden see that this aligns exactly with the long-run growth perspective. So what you basically see is, yes, Latin America has been in school for a long while, but their actual performance in terms of basic skills in math and science is tremendously low, actually not very much above the one in Africa, whereas Asia is totally away from that. It's actually very close to the average achievement level of the European countries and these Commonwealth OECD countries. And so if you put this together, if you put the test scores and the growth rates together, you can see that they pretty much align with one another more or less directly over time. Or if you want to put that into one big picture of the world regions over time, and this is actually one of the pictures that actually where we just go somewhat longer. Look, this is 1960 to 2009, the data available for kind of 50 years exactly. This is the growth rate on average of the countries in the different regions. And this is just a test score on average across all these international student achievement tests. Both axes say conditional because what we take out on both sides is any effects of the differences in the initial level of GDP. And basically what you see is that countries that at the beginning of the period are poorer tend to catch up to the richer countries, actually by basically imitating what they've been doing. You can say it in general, and so we basically take that out. But otherwise just plot the two things against one another, and what you basically see is that you get a very steep line where all the world regions basically align pretty closely along the lines. So here's the East Asian region, here's Europe actually subdivided into three groups, where you can also see that all these separately fall on the line: Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Central Europe, the MENA region, the Commonwealth OECD countries, Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, so a little bit noise down here. But on average, if you would basically run a regression across these, 2, 4, 6, 8 observations, your R squared is basically 0.98 or something. Statistically, you've basically fully explained why some world regions have pulled off over 50 years and others haven't. I mean, this is of course a totally descriptive piece, but this is the main motivation why we want to go deeper into this, and this is the motivation for the whole research. This is the motivation for what I'm going to talk about over the next half hour. In terms of saying, if you want to understand why some regions have become rich and others have stayed poor, probably your explanation will have to do something with the knowledge of the people. This is the big time driver. Just one final thing before I start in real. Why do we care about these growth rates? I mean, these are growth rates on average between around 1% and around 4 to 5%, which is if we grow for 2 or 3% this year to next year, I mean, we basically won't notice. It doesn't really make so much of a difference whether our growth rate is 1 or 2%, higher or lower. The point is, if you do that consistently for 50 years, that does make all the difference. I mean, apparently, Albert Einstein once said, it's a bit hard to verify actually, but he's quoted as saying that compound interest is the strongest force in the universe. Something that people don't quite realize most of the time. So this is simple math actually. If you start up with 100 euros, and then you grow by 0% for 10, 25 or 50 years, you stay you keep your 100 euros, but if you grow by 1%, 50 years later, you're going to have 146 euros. If instead you go by 5%, you're going to have 1,100 euros. So even small differences in growth rates, if you keep them going for 50 years, because you grow on a higher rate all the time, make a huge difference after 50 years. So this is what on average many sub-Saharan African countries have seen. So they're basically, the people living there today are some 60% richer than their grandparents, like 2 generations ago. On average, in many of these East Asian countries, people who live there today, they actually literally have grown, like the whole region has grown on average by 4.5%. I mean, several countries have grown by more than 5% for 50 years. If you do that for 50 years, the people today will be 11 times as prosperous as their grandparents. This is the big thing we want to understand. And I'm going to argue that this, to a very large extent, will be due to the fact that people in East Asian countries actually have got good education, know a lot, have like accumulated very important skills that allows them like to keep their economy growing. And the same is just not true for people in most sub-Saharan African countries, and actually, interestingly, also for Latin American countries. Okay, so let me go into this into more detail. Let me start quickly to give you a little framework of what I'm talking about. Let me start by a little bit of what economists have done in this area in terms of theory. So why would we expect that the education of the people affects long-run growth? There's actually basically 3 types of models that have come up over the past, well, I know more than 20 years. How people, how economists like to think about long-run growth. One of these areas is the so-called augmented neoclassical growth model. So here the basic idea is you just have a simple production function where the output is produced by different inputs, and traditionally this was capital and labor. You can accumulate capital, like buy more machines, build more firms, build more factories. And by doing so, you can actually grow because you have more inputs to produce with, but actually, like the factor labor was pretty much like one homogeneous factor, just like one worker is like the other worker. And then what people added there around that time was to say, wait a minute, after all, we cannot just invest into machines, we can also invest into the knowledge and skills of people. And that's why what people like to call human capital, because when you invest into humans, they get more skilled, and maybe then basically you can also accumulate this factor. It's not just labor, it's actually augmented by the human capital of these people. And so during the process of investing into education, making your workers more productive, your economy will actually grow because you're getting from one level of input factors to a higher level of input factors. But once you're at the higher level, like better educated people, you will keep growing at the same old rate, just like transitioning from the one equilibrium to the new equilibrium, your economy will grow faster. What people have been a bit uneasy with this type of models is that ultimately the real source of long-run economic growth is not explained within the models. It's kind of taken as exogenous. There's going to be technological change, and by technological change, with the same amount of inputs, you can produce more output. But that's something hard to explain. And this was actually the start of the so-called endogenous growth theories. It's a whole big class of models these days. Interestingly, though, again, education enters at center stage in all these models. And here the basic idea is, okay, in the long run, it's all about technological change, about innovation, new ideas. That's where, with the same amount of inputs, all of a sudden you can produce more output. But then in these models, the point is sometimes this, the new innovations come out of nowhere, but more often than not, these are also actually the process of firms investing into research and development. So they invest into this, but what is the main input factor in the R&D sector in these firms? Well, it's probably again scientists. It's the quality of the workers there, it's the knowledge of the people there. And so in these models, it's the case that the education of the population doesn't just is just another input factor, but it's important for the development of new ideas and technologies, which will then generate the innovations that in the long run will lift the whole economy to a higher level of technological production. In such a world, actually, if you lift the education level of your population, your growth rate will be higher forever, because like you're just going to produce more ideas at a faster rate, and then like in the long run keep on growing faster. So this is one of the main differences between these two classes of models. There's a third one, just quickly, which is very related to the second one, where the point is that maybe these innovations, new technologies come from outside. So think about like our country, like something new comes up in the US, people like think of Google or whatever, and then the question is to what extent can other countries use these new technologies also in the firms and so on. And here again the idea is the extent to which you can adopt these new technologies that come exogenously into your economy will depend on the education of your population, because this is needed to be able to implement these new technologies. So it's the same spirit. So basically what you see though is that in all these types of models, the education of the population is an important driver in different ways in how your economy grows in the long run. I think empirically it's actually very hard to disentangle these different models. Actually we have done projections based on these different types of models, which in the first place sound so very different. But if you actually do that and put the parameters into the model, the point is that for the first 40, 50 years, like your growth rates will be hardly different, even though, I mean, this will just shift you to a new level, and this can have long run effects on the long run growth rates. But actually long run here is very long run, and so actually for a long while it's very hard to differentiate these models. So my personal view is there's probably all these things that I've been talking about are at work in the real world, and probably at different, to different extents and at different levels. But in the end, it's probably a mix of all these things that happen in the real world. Anyway, here are different reasons why the education of the population may affect long-run growth. The question is, do they? And so we want to go there and test these theories empirically. And like the workhorse on how this is usually done is so-called cross-country growth regression. So basically, you look at as many countries as possible around the world, look at the and take the long-run growth rates of these economies as your dependent variable, as a variable you want to explain, and then you put in different input factors, and one of them will be measures of human capital. And so this literature has emerged step by step over a long run. So initially you didn't have any data on the education of the people in different countries. Then it started off looking at literacy rates. UNESCO actually had gathered that for many countries for a while. Then people have started to actually look at school enrollment rates, and from all these data then there was like a lot of effort, most of all by two guys called Barrow and Lee, that invested a lot into getting a very nice big data set of the average years of schooling of the working age population in each country in the world, as far back as possible and as extensive as possible, partly from census data and so on and so forth. This is where actually we got the data from, and this very important development over time that we haven't had some 25 years ago. And this is basically this type of years of schooling that I initially alluded to. So if you know, rather than looking at these big chunks of world regions, look at individual countries. This is more or less what it looks like. You've got all the countries for which we've got these data. You've got the average years of schooling of the working age population in these countries. And here you've got the long-run growth rate, 1960 to 2000 again, as a dependent variable. And again, as before, we're gonna like condition both, basically meaning calculating out any effects of the initial level of GDP per capita, because initially poorer countries are going to catch up, and we're going to take that out of the equation. And if you do that, what you see is like this. So in the end, actually, if you do it like this, you do see a positive association. You see that on average countries that have higher years of schooling do grow faster than those who have small years of, little years of schooling. But you also see that this is kind of also like a big cloud, and so for many countries, this association doesn't explain at all why these have grown so fast or these have grown so slow. So basically they've got similar years of schooling, but actually some had growth rates of 6 to 7% and others just around 0. So ultimately this model, if you look at the explained share of the variation across countries in long-run growth rates, so the R square of such a regression, you basically statistically explain a quarter of the long-run growth difference across countries by such a model. It's actually just as like, I don't want to go into this into any detail, but actually we've also done quite a bit of work, as Daniel indicated, into the history, particularly using like very nice, like small regional data from Prussia to look at whether education actually was also relevant historically, at least since times of the Industrial Revolution. And like for a long while, researchers had thought that actually during the 18th, 19th century, education wasn't really important for economic growth. Like famous saying by John Moncure, one of the leading experts in economic history, was that the industrialization happened in England despite and not because of its education system, which is probably kind of true. It wasn't very developed there. We looked at this like industrial follower country, Germany, and we see very strong evidence that also like already in the early 1900s, early 1800s, of course, so during the time of the Industrial Revolution in Germany, we very strongly see that regions that had higher levels of education of the population were the ones that industrialized faster and grew richer already then. So it may actually be something that has been with us for much longer than we generally think. But here I want to focus on post-war growth rates, so usually always start in 1960s, so modern growth. Okay, but as I already indicated, looking at years of schooling can only go so far. In particular, it has this problem that you basically have to assume that 1 year of schooling gives you the same amount of human capital, of skills and knowledge in different countries, which if you like have ever visited different countries and looked into their schools, for example, is just, of course, total nonsense. And hence this idea that we try to measure knowledge directly rather than measuring how long you've been sitting in classrooms. And this is by looking at these international tests of student achievement in basic cognitive skills, namely math and science, that have been done since the mid-1960s. So the first international math study was performed in 1965, and since then, and for this study here we go to the year 2003 to try to average as many international tests as possible. Basically there have been 12 testing occasions since, like there was the first science study in the early 70s, then a second math study in the early 80s, a second science study in the mid 80s, further math and science studies in the 90s, and then came PISA, and we tried to combine all of these testing occasions. There were basically 36 separate test observations, because many of these tests were done like in math or science or both, or were done at the 4th grade level, at the 8th grade level, or at 15-year-olds. So you actually have a lot of different tests there. And what we try to do is, these were independent tests at the time, and with kind of some hand waving and some econometric calibration, we try to put all these tests onto a common scale. And then the first step that we're going to do is just take the average performance of each country on these different tests, and the ones they participated in, to get like a proxy for the average skills of the working population that we're seeing there. Nothing of this is perfect, there's a lot of data problems in there as well, but this is kind of, we try to do it as good as we can. It's also, I should add here, so this is math and science. Our basic idea was that we take this because it's most easily measurable across countries and comparable. There's also quite a few reading tests. We did the same stuff in reading and it gives you the same answer actually, so this is something, it's really the basic idea to get a measure of basic skills. It's also, I don't want to claim that this is the only thing that matters in terms of educational achievement, in terms of knowledge. There are going to be many more skills that are relevant, also some sort of non-cognitive skills that are relevant in the labor market. These are just going to be much harder to measure, and to some extent, to the extent that they are going to be correlated with the measures that we measure, you should actually think of this as a basic skill measure that combines all of these things, rather than just thinking about math or science per se. Now, if you do this, the general picture of the world that you get looks like this. Of course, you cannot read it. That's the whole idea of it. I'm aware of that. But okay, here's the test score. We're just going to put it up. That has this, by construction, the international mean of students in OECD countries of 500, and then basically it's got a way of measuring it that has a standard deviation of 100 within the OECD. But basically, I just want to give you the basic picture of what this looks like when you do it. So here, the first column are the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There's actually only 3 that ever participated. This is South Africa, Ghana, and Zimbabwe, and you can see that these are very low down here. And this is Latin America, and it looks pretty much the same. You've got Peru very down here, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, but even the best country, according to this measure, is way, like I said, around some 430 points in here. This is the Middle East, North Africa region, also looks very similar here. Then you've got Asia, and Asia is kind of interesting. So you've got a few countries like Philippines and Indonesia, and to some extent India, that are at the same level overall as these countries. But then you've got some other countries, and most notably Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, and to the extent that we got measures also for China, which is about the moment, that really came out totally on top of these international tests. Some of these participated already in the 1970s, particularly Hong Kong, and all of a sudden they were placed number 1 on top of these OECD countries, which was a big surprise at the moment, so at that time. So what you basically see is that some of these East Asian countries are really even way ahead in terms of these achievement tests than the European countries. Here's Eastern Europe. The way, I mean, I've put in some of these countries in gray, so the dark ones are the ones I'm going to be using. The problem, of course, about most of these East Asian countries, Eastern European countries, as well as some of the other countries, is that we don't have long-run data on the growth of real GDP per capita during communist times, because there was just no measure of these that is internationally comparable, so we cannot use them in our growth regressions. But these countries actually, I mean, there's a few who are down here, like Albania or Macedonia, but actually most of these like do relatively, comparatively the same way that other European countries do. Actually, the Czech Republic would be around here. Actually, it's been doing very well on these overall achievement tests already. And so this is Western Europe. They're kind of bunched together around here, around this 500 line. And you can see, like, whatever, according to this measure, you've got Switzerland, Finland, the Netherlands up there. It also goes down, and maybe not totally at random, kind of interesting, like at the bottom of it, here is Portugal and Greece, and here's then Italy and Spain. And if you think about the crisis that we've been having over the past 10 years, it's not uncorrelated with what you're looking at here. And here's these Commonwealth OECD countries doing similarly to the European countries. So the big point I want to make is, you can draw one big red line across this picture, and you're going to totally separate the European and OECD countries from the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the MENA region. And interestingly, you've got some East Asian countries that are actually way ahead of even the Western countries. So there's huge variation across the world in terms of like what students have learned and then later on taking the labor market. Big question is this in any sense correlated with the growth performance of these countries? And so this is going to be the main result of what I want to show you. And then I'm trying to convince you that what we see there is actually something like an effect of skills on growth. It's the same picture again. We used to have this picture where we have economic growth here, as we have again, but plotted it against years of schooling. Now we plot it against this test measure that I've just shown you. And what you basically see is that all the countries in the world align relatively closely along this relatively steep line. So you basically see that any country that did very well on these international student achievement tests are the countries that in the long run had very long run growth rates. And all the countries that are down here in terms of test scores are also down here in terms of growth rates. Like as I indicated, with years of schooling, you kind of statistically explain just a quarter of the international variation in long run growth rates. With this simple model, you all of a sudden explain 3/4. Like more than 3/4 of the long run differences in economic growth rates are explained by the simple model that simply takes into account the math and science skills of the populations. So this kind of gives you the power of this type of idea that it is the knowledge, what we like to call the knowledge capital of the nations, by emphasizing it's really what the people know that is relevant, not how long they spend in schools. This is the picture of years of schooling and growth that I've shown you before, and then you saw that this is slash earlier. There is a positive relationship, but it's much less clear than with test scores. But what happens if we add to the same model the test scores that I just showed you, then basically the relation between growth rates and years of schooling looks like this. There's basically nothing left. There's one big cloud, and like the association or the correlation is zero. What does this mean? This doesn't mean that years of schooling are irrelevant for economic growth, but it means that years of schooling are only relevant for economic growth to the extent that they relate to better test scores. And any of the years of schooling variation that you see that is independent of what students have actually learned, so this is what you're doing when you control for the test score of the population in these models, any years of schooling that you've got there that is not related to what people have actually learned has no association whatsoever with long-run growth. It's really what people have known. So for those of you who like do a little bit of empirical economics or econometrics, here's like just one little table about regressions to show you what it actually means. Those of you who don't, just ignore this. It's not relevant. I showed you in the pictures, it's the same story. So each column here is one regression, 50 countries for which we've got this test score information and economic growth information. The first model is the one that just has years of schooling and the initial level of GDP per capita. The R squared is 20.25. And if you, rather than measuring education by years of schooling, you measure it by this test score measure, you basically first of all see like a very strong, like an incredibly large t-value in terms of statistical significance of the association, but you also see that the R squared jumps to kind of 0.373. And if you put both of them together in the model and do a horse race, basically the test score measure doesn't change at all, but the effect of years of schooling goes to zero. This is just the pictures I just showed you. It's really what people have learned and not how long they took to learn it that's relevant for both. I mean, and we've got hundreds of these type of robustness regressions in our book. So this is like, I showed you the very, very, very simple picture, but we do many, many, many more things in the book. I don't want to bore you with that. The point is that this is as robust as you can think. It's kind of, it just, you cannot kick it out, it's just there. It's there if you just look at developed countries, it's there if you just look at developing countries, it's there if you look at math, or if you look at science, if you look at primary school test scores, if you look at secondary school test scores, like you can do hundreds of things there. Maybe two things I'm just going to show you. One thing that's a little bit unfair in how we're doing it here is kind of cognitive skills are the average across this whole period that's kind of by data constraints. I mean, we would love to have all countries' test scores in the 1960s, but we don't. But for years of schooling, we basically measure it at the initial period, 1960. But if you instead take the average years of schooling between 1960 and 2000, this is the same result. I mean, this is not at all driven by that measure. And the other thing, like initially I showed you this big picture of world regions where you basically you can see East Asia and Latin America, and you can explain the pattern across world regions. But of course, many other things also differ across world regions, like specific cultures, values, what have you. And so you're never quite sure what you see there, but now I've shown you that it had, like you see the same picture across 50 countries, but we can go one step further and actually basically exclude any of the variation that exists across the world regions. So I showed you that you see the strong relationship across world regions. Now we can also say, let's ignore all the variation across world regions and just look at differences in growth rates and differences in test scores within each of these world regions. And this is what this analysis does. It basically adds 8 dummies for the different world regions that I initially showed you, but you basically see the same result again. It's really, it's a slightly smaller, but it's actually not even statistically significantly so from the previous results. And you can see exactly the same picture there. So even if you just look at within world regions, test scores are very strongly related to long-run growth. One thing where these effects do differ is by the kind of broad economic institutions that the different countries have. You can either measure it by openness to international trade or by the extent to which the country has institutions that protect against expropriation, so that has good property rights. So you can see in open economies and in relatively secure economies, the effect of cognitive skills on economic growth is much larger than in closed economies or economies where the overall structure of the economy isn't very protective. So in that sense, like in poorly organized economies, the knowledge of the people cannot translate as well into higher economic growth, whereas in open economies and where property rights are reasonably well protected, the effect of the knowledge of the people is even larger. So one additional thing that we did so far, I've been just talking about the average achievement of the people in the different countries. One thing like we also wanted to understand is to what extent is this driven by the higher or lower end of achievement in a country. It goes a little bit back to these different theories that I talked to you about. So if it's these neoclassical models are correct, then you would basically think about like an average shift in the overall population, like across the board, raising your human capital. If you think about these endogenous growth models, it's more like you need to have these rocket scientists that work in the R&D labs and come up with the new ideas of the future. So it's really the upper tail of the distribution that's relevant here. So we wanted to understand which one is it empirically. And one way to do that is basically we went into all these international achievement tests, into the micro data of all these older tests, and basically measured. So I showed you that they have an average mean of 500. And so basically what we did is we looked at the share in each country of students that reached at least 400, which is kind of what you could basically see. This is basically being literate at all, like having a basic level of literacy in these skills. So the share of kids that reach 400, and as a second measure, the share of kids that reach 600, which is a very high level, which in most countries is below 1 or 2% of the students. But there are some countries like Taiwan where close to 20% achieve at above 600. So these are the rocket scientists of the future. Now, which of these two measures, and these two are highly correlated, countries that do well in one dimension do well in the other dimension, but they have some separate variations. So there are some countries that do particularly well at the top, others that do particularly well at the bottom, so we can enter both of these into our growth regressions, and basically what we see is both enter significantly into the model, meaning that probably both mechanisms are important, but also meaning that it's not enough to focus just on the top part of the distribution, or you can just look at the bottom part of the distribution. I think politically it really means that you cannot have just a very elitist education system that just educates the best and ignores the rest, but you also cannot have a very equalizing education where you don't promote those at the very top. I think you have to try to do both. You cannot do one or the other. Oops. Okay. So one thing I do want to talk about a little bit, it's going to be very brief, and in the book we've got a long chapter on this, is that I've now talked a lot about associations, and you see the strong association between test scores and growth, and I talked about it as if it's the case that the better test scores of the people cause higher growth rates. But of course this is just a correlation. I mean, the big question is what causes what? So you can easily think about basically two most important sources of why you see this association without test scores causing growth. The first issue, of course, is maybe just the other way around. Maybe it's just because some countries grow faster, they can invest more into their education system, get a better education system, and then their skills get better. So maybe, like you saw, this association, but maybe it's just because faster growing countries get better skills. I mean, I did calculate, condition out any effect of the initial level of GDP, but maybe the growth also makes a difference there. But even more fundamentally, I mean, any other factors that correlate both with test scores and with economic growth and are not yet contained in the model could give rise to this association. So first thing that we do a lot about in the book is you want to think about other things that may be important for economic growth and add them to the model, things like openness and property rights, things like the regulation of labor markets and product markets in different countries, but you can think about fertility rates, geography, closeness to the tropics, for example, different types of cultural factors. So we did try dozens and dozens of these things, entering them to the model. Basically, none of them enter significantly in the model as soon as test scores are in there, and none of these would change the result of test scores. Literally the only things that enter significantly on top of test scores are these institutional measures, which are also relevant for economic growth, and I showed you that they actually do interact with the effect of test scores. But still, you can never be sure that you can measure all these things, so you want to think about other ways on how to make sure that the association that you're seeing is not driven by things that you don't observe, like Asian values or anything like that, that actually are important for these analyses. So we do a lot about this, but let me just give you a very quick overview of what's in there. I mean, the first obvious and most simple thing is try to measure test scores before you measure the growth rates. And the main reason why we didn't do it so far is for data reasons, because we don't have so many test scores in early years. But actually for some 25 countries, we have test scores up until the early 1980s. So we just take those test scores and use this as explanatory variable for economic growth since, for example, 1985 or 1990. And you see exactly the same result. If anything, the coefficient gets even bigger in this model. So it's not just the reverse causality thing. Like the simple thing to do is just like take initial test scores, take later observed growth rates, which cannot have affected the previous test scores, and you see the same result. But still, there could be omitted factors that drive both. So one reason why maybe some of these concerns are really as big as you might initially think is that if you look across countries, additional spending in the school system is literally unrelated to the test scores of the students. Meaning that, I mean, maybe that's the main reason why growing, like having higher GDPs, being able to invest more into the education system actually doesn't improve your test scores. Problem is, it's not that simple. And then we do some things that I really want to like jump across right now here, that try to find variation in test scores that is arguably like part of the variation in test scores that you can better argue is exogenous to your growth process. So for example, we do what economists like to call instrumental variables models, where we take institutional structures of the school systems to make sure that these emerge from the school system. Things like whether you've got centralized exam systems or not, whether like the share of privately operated in schools in the system, the share of autonomous schools in the system, so the decentralization or centralization of schools, and the relative pay of teachers, so not the absolute pay, but relative within the country's wage distribution. All of these things have been shown in micro-literature to be correlated with test scores, and all of these may be arguably at least more exogenous as most of what we're looking at here. At least they stem from the education system. You can use any of these things I talked about as instruments for the test scores, use only the variation in test scores driven by these institutional structures of the school system, and you basically get exactly the same result. The next thing we've been doing, and that's maybe the closest you can get to at least being relatively sure that what you see is something that's not just driven by cultures of the countries or by the economic structures and institutions of the countries, is the following. We went into just one country, namely the United States, took the census data from the United States, and looked at immigrants, how immigrants do on this labor market, on this one labor market with the same economic structure and so on. But immigrants from these different countries, and we basically look at whether like the quality of their home country school systems as measured by our test score measure predicts how much these people are going to earn on the US labor market. And so basically what we do see, there's a pretty strong return to quality of home country school system on the US labor market for at the individual level for these people, immigrants working on the US labor market. But here's the big thriller of this analysis. We do see this return to home country test scores, but we can do this separately for those people who immigrated into the US at the age between 0 and 6, so basically with their parents, and those who then went into the US school system. So they literally didn't go to school at home, but they come from the same home countries as the ones who immigrated age 18 to 25, who come from exactly the same countries, but actually went to school at home. And what we basically see is the strong effect of home country school system is there only for those who went to school at home, and the effect is 0 for the ones who come from the same countries, but actually literally didn't go to school at home, but actually went to school in the United States. And you can do this like what econometricians like to call the diffs and diffs model, where you do that out. So basically, it's literally, if you do this for the US educated, the effect of continental is literally 0, and it's 16% per standard deviation for those educated in their home countries. So you can difference in differences, and then you get basically the same model because it's 0 here. It's kind of pretty straightforward. Anyway. And the final thing we can do, so anything I talked about so far is like we just average across the test scores, which is like a first approximation for the average skill of the population. But then again, of course, like there have been tests at different points in time, and at least for some 15 countries, we actually have enough observations to do like to estimate a trend of test scores from the early 60s till the early 2000s. And so we can look at, take out any level differences across countries and look at whether the trend in the test scores that we observe is correlated with the trend in growth rate that we observe. And we were like, as I indicated, it's just a few countries, it's kind of very just descriptive. What we basically see is all the countries that improved their test scores are the countries that actually also had positive trends in their growth rates, and the countries down here that have 0 or negative trends in test scores actually also have poor trends in growth rates. So even there you can see this association. Okay, let me drop the final thing. This is what we did. Okay, let me focus in, and that's going to be the final thing about this analysis, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about policies. Let me focus in again on what I started off with, namely this big puzzle, why did Latin America grow so poorly, and at the same time, why did we see this East Asian growth miracle? What we did in this analysis is actually we did extend the sample of countries by some 9 additional countries from Latin America, because there are some regional tests in Latin America, and we basically spliced them into the international tests. So basically now we've got data for all 16 mainland Latin American countries that have more than 1 million inhabitants. So we are pretty rich in terms of data for Latin America now. And here's the test scores that we get, and here's the years of schooling, like the traditional measure. And all the blue spots are the countries outside of East Asia and Latin America. Red is Latin America, and these black indicated countries are East Asian countries. So the blue dots are all the other countries, and so far we can draw regression lines through these other countries, which is actually a pretty good predictor. So you can see on average, of course, these other countries' years of schooling are very strongly related to test scores. So it is, at the end of the day, a fact that these two are highly correlated. But what you basically see is, once you do this, is that the two regions that really fall out of the picture are East Asia and Latin America. So for any years of schooling, basically all the countries in Latin America have very poor skills. They went to school for relatively long but didn't learn anything. And exactly the opposite happens for the East Asian countries. So for them, for each year of schooling, they get much more learning than the average country in the world. Now, what happens if we do this, enter this now into the growth regressions? So here's the picture again. It's basically the same picture as before, just with the additional countries and highlighting these two regions. The years of schooling and the growth rate. You do see that there's this positive association across countries, but it's really interesting that you basically don't explain at all why East Asia grew so fast or why Latin America grew so poor, because basically all the Latin American countries are below the regression line. They grew much slower than you would predict by years of schooling, and all the East Asian countries are above the regression line. Now, how does this look if we look at test scores rather than years of schooling? This is what you get. So basically, you get all the countries aligning very nicely along this one regression line. It's true for the East Asian countries here, it's true for the Latin American countries here, so both within these regions and across these regions, you basically account for the differences in growth rates. So with test score differences, you fully account for the fact why these countries have seen a miracle and why this is such a puzzle. It's no puzzle anymore. It's not puzzling as soon as you think about or look at what the people actually know. So for those of you who know regression analysis, it's quite amazing what you see. Take these 59 countries, just put in an indicator for Latin America, just a dummy. You see that on average, these countries grew by 1.7 percentage point per year less than the rest of the world. You put in initial years of schooling and initial GDP per capita, and it doesn't change at all. So you can, with these two factors, you can explain it all why Latin America grew so poorly. You add test scores, and this goes to basically 0. It's totally reduced, no significant anymore. So basically, you've killed the puzzle why they grew so slowly. And the same as from the opposite side for East Asia, they grew by 2.5% percentage points on average faster than the rest of the world. You had years of schooling in GDP per capita, this is reduced by some 20%, but it's still like you don't explain why they grew 2% per year faster than the rest of the world. You had test scores at 0. So this is a really powerful thing. Okay, let me drop this one. You can take these models and these estimates and then project out what you would gain in terms of your economy if you would improve your school systems and then see what happens over time. Like if you improve your school systems, the kids learn more. For the next 5 years, what happens to your economy? Basically nothing, because these kids are not even in the labor market. So if you want to improve your economy during like one political cycle, education is not going to give you that. It's going to take very long. I mean, because then, like, one new cohort enters the labor market and one older cohort goes into retirement, but actually, like, if you think about whatever, people being in the labor market for 40 years, it's going to take you 40, like every year it's just 2.5% of the labor force that's exchanged. It's going to take you another 40 years until like the whole labor force is better. And this means actually any of these effects take long, but you can do the projections, you can discount the future benefits that you get, and however you do it, you get very big numbers if you're willing to look into the long run. If you do care about how your kids are going to do on the labor market over their lifetime, these give you very big effects. Actually, there's a chapter in the book on this. We actually have done another study last year for the OECD called Universal Basic Skills, where we do exactly these projections. So if you're interested in just look at it. But Daniel told me that he actually did something like this for the Czech Republic anyway, and so and he's presented it here before, so you'll probably know most of this. Let me close with a little discussion, maybe for some 5 to 10 minutes, on what this means for policy, in particular for education policy. So basically, no, it means we really have to, like, if we want to get long-run economic growth, if we want to get prosperity, we should focus on the basic skills of the population. So how can we improve how our students do on these international achievement tests is basically the big question. Just like to give you a stylized picture of how some selected countries have done over time on these tests. So you basically see that there's quite a lot of consistency, so a lot of these things do not change much over time, so some countries are relatively good, others aren't that good. But there's also like big time changes. So this is not destiny. You can really see that there are countries like Finland that actually took off in the 80s. There's even like Japan that actually was on a high level, but even there over the past 10 years improved quite a bit. Or like Germany actually did improve steadily over the 2000s. But there's other countries like Finland that like improved, but actually over the past 6 to 7 years, like they really went down big time in the education system. Or Sweden actually started to go down for a much longer while. So you see that like it's probably not easy to change your education system and to improve it, but it's also, I mean, it is possible. Countries have done so, but you can also fall back quite a bit. So you can change things. What is it that can be changed? Like the first idea that politicians always have is just put more money into the system. So here's what the picture looks like. Here's you can do this in terms of the average level of achievement of different countries on the PISA test and plot it against the expenditure per student, and you won't see any association. That's what I indicated too. So countries that spend more do not perform any better than countries that spend little. But with the PISA data, which has started off in the year 2000, by now you can actually look at least 12 years of changes in test scores, and you can look at changes in spending. So is it at least the case that those countries who invested much more over time then saw their kids learn more? So here's the change in the PISA reading score between 2000 and 2012, and here's the change in expenditure per student over the same time, and basically what you see is, again, no correlation whatsoever. Here's the Czech Republic. Apparently, according to this measure, you invested quite a bit more per student into the school system, but you basically stuck at the same PISA level. And there's countries
like Israel that really went much better, but actually hasn't increased spending much, and other countries like Iceland or Sweden that are at the same level of spending increases, but actually they fell down big time. If you want to understand why some countries do so much better than others on these tests, or why they change differently over time on these tests, spending will not be the answer. So I'm not saying that spending is totally irrelevant, but it's not going to be the big time answer you want to have. Same is true, for example, if you would look at class size, you would get the same picture there. What I think we have learned in the economics of education over the past 15 years is that what's probably much more relevant is the institutional structures of the school system. And by that I basically mean anything of the rules of the game that are set in the system. So the extent of exam systems, the extent of autonomy of schools, whether you've got private competition in the school system. These are things that, if you particularly look at across countries, are very strongly related to student achievement. So the basic idea here is a very basic economics idea, I think, is that people respond to incentives. And so maybe the best hope you can have to improve student achievement is to make sure that your investments are used efficiently and effectively. And the way to do it is probably to make sure that everybody who is in the system, meaning students themselves, parents, teachers, administrators, everybody who's basically working in the system, that they have incentives to focus on improving student outcomes. It's like a very basic general term, but I think that's exactly what we basically see. So if people aren't rewarded at all for whether their students do very good or very badly, you won't get much improvement. If they do see at some general level that it's worth putting a lot of effort in improving your outcomes, then you will see that. And so this is where the institutional reforms come into place, because they, at the very basic level, provide these incentive schemes that may or may not create better student outcomes. So three things that we like to discuss in these areas as general: the accountability introduced by testing systems, where basically at the end of, like in particular, external exit exams at the end of secondary school, what you see very systematically is that countries that have external exit exams perform much better on these tests than countries that do not have them. And probably the main interpretation of that is that at the end of the day, there will be an external evaluation on what you've achieved in terms of your schools. And that then opens up the whole box for anybody to observe which schools are doing good and which schools are doing badly, and that creates the incentives actually to do better. Whereas if there's no external exams, whatever you're going to do, no one's going to ever observe it, because you basically do your own exams and you can like define the standards of them themselves. So this is one very big driver that holds school systems accountable. Once you have accountability, but only then, you also see that students do better in schools that have more autonomy, in particular in terms of choosing their own personnel and in terms of day-to-day work, some budgetary elements and the like choosing textbooks, these things. It's very interesting. For the reasons of time, I'm not going to go into the details here, but actually basically what you see is that if you don't have external exit exams, actually autonomy can actually be bad, can backfire, because you give schools autonomy, but no one holds them accountable for what they use it for, and what you're going to see in the end is actually they can reduce achievement. But if, and like in systems that have external exit exams, you then see that this autonomy effect completely turns around into a pretty strong positive effect, because then it seems to be the case that if you set the standard externally and if you like test them in the end, the best way to get there is to let schools like find their own ways, because they will know best, much better than any central planner to do that. And the same in that sense is true for choice and competition. So basically what we see is that student achievement is much higher in countries that have a higher share of schools that are not publicly managed. So basically privately managed schools, you could say, but most of these are non-profit schools, like church-based schools and other non-profit organizations. The point is that you've got different operators. It's not just the state monopoly running the schools, but you've got to separate that from the financing of schools. So basically what we see is there's a strong positive association in that countries where the state, like the more funding comes from the state, the better is achievement in schools. Meaning that if you like, if the parents or other private elements have to pay large tuition fees, for example, that actually reduces achievement in the country overall. But very different is the effect of operation, where we see exactly the opposite. There, the more non-state operators you find, the better is the average achievement. And the standard for that is the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, 3/4 of students going to schools that are not operated by the state, but actually that are private schools. But all these schools are funded in the same way by the government. That's actually said in the constitution in the Netherlands, that basically independent of school operation, the state funds the school by the same amount X. And this is a system where basically parents have a lot of choice. They can choose between different types of schools, and if they realize that the one school is not doing well, they're just going to send their kids to another school. And this creates incentives in the same way it does anywhere else in the economy. And it seems to be working the same way in the school system. Okay, final point that I want to discuss is the final aspect of the school curriculum. Or basically of the curriculum in general of the education system. And there the big discussion is between like whether you should have more vocational education or more general education. And I think this is something that's very similar between Germany and the Czech Republic, as far as I understand. So across the world, some countries, I mean most notably probably Germany with this dual system, but actually the Czech Republic is another example, tend to stress vocational education, where the idea is that you prepare students to work in specific occupations by developing very specific and job-related skills. So you train people to a very specific occupation. And other countries, actually like the US, has totally done away with that system basically, and they strongly emphasize a general curriculum where the idea is you're going to provide students with basic knowledge and skills in math and science and some communication, these type of skills, but none directly job related to one specific occupation. And then you just hope that this serves as the foundation for further learning on the job, so you learn all these occupation specific skills on the job. And what we've shown, or what we like to argue, is that there's really a trade-off involved in these two things. So both have their pros and cons. The big advantage of the vocational system is that it facilitates the entry into the labor market for young people. So you directly get these occupation-specific skills. The firms see you have already exactly the skills that they need in the labor market, so it's easier to find a job, it's easier to start working directly in the labor market. Actually, the evidence on that isn't all that strong, to be honest, but that's basically what's generally been argued, but you see actually in different studies in different countries, you sometimes see that, but like just as often you don't see it either. But that's the basic idea. Our main point is that this totally ignores a life cycle perspective. So this is just labor market entry. So what happens in the longer run, and there may be the big advantages of the general curriculum. If it's true that these basic skills that you provide people with would make it easier for people to adapt to any change in the economy. So if there's structural change, like certain occupations, like there's globalization, like whole industries go to Asia, there's technological change, all of a sudden, like the specific thing that you've been doing isn't used anymore because you've got robots or any computerization. Then, if you've got very specific skills that are very specific to one job, these are very likely to become obsolete over time. Whereas the hope is that these general skills would make it easier for you to adapt to any of these changes and then go to another occupation where again you're going to learn the specific skills again on the job. And so, if that's true, you're going to have this trade-off. If you are willing to look at the entire employment life cycle, that early on, vocational systems may be very useful, but actually in the long run, this may be turning into a disadvantage where like these advantages of vocational skills will actually decrease with age. And this is what actually we in some other research have seen very strongly, in particular in countries that have these type of apprenticeship systems that very strongly focus on one specific occupation, like in Germany. Like in the data that we have there, we've got data for Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. Actually, since then, we've also been looking at Austria, for example. You see the same pattern. If you just simply look at the employment probabilities of individuals, but look at that over the age life cycle. So here's the young people, here's the older people, here's the average employment rate. The blue line is those who got a general education. The yellow line is those who got a vocational education. What you see is indeed that there's this area at young ages where vocational education you've got this area at younger ages where actually vocationals do much better. So like this is consistent with vocational specific education facilitating labor market entry, but that actually does turn around at some stage, and at later ages, the ones who got a vocational education are much more likely to lose their jobs and then not to find a new job in the labor market, whereas those who got a general education are more likely to keep a job or like to be able to find a new job in another area. And so I think when like there's no general good or bad on average about vocational or general education, but there is this trade-off that we have to be aware of. And the more changing our economies are, the more we should make sure that everybody gets at least a certain amount of general skills that allow you to adapt to change. Okay, let me quickly conclude with the basic general pattern. I think what we want to argue is that in the long run, the prosperity of nations is directly linked to the skills of the population. And these relevant skills, what we like to call this knowledge capital of nations, can actually be measured pretty well by these like very simple, basic international math and science achievement tests. And the relationships we've seen there are very strong and indicate that any improvement in skills would actually achieve a lot of increase in prosperity in the long run. It's not easy to improve skills in your education system, but it's also not impossible, and I think the best bet there is to focus on the incentives and on the institutions that get there. But if you manage to reform successfully in the sense that actually your kids do learn more, then all the evidence that we've seen is means that it's very likely that you're going to see your country pull away from those countries that don't reform and don't improve their student achievement. So I guess like the very bottom line is that the evidence, if you're willing to look at the evidence, then this pretty strongly pushes towards a general view of long-run growth that has to be based on the knowledge capital of nations. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think we are a little bit behind the time, so there is time for a couple of questions. They can go back to the presentation or to the German opinion on vocational, general education or stuff like that. There. Yours first.
Hello, my name is Karel. I would like to ask a question about the generic education and the elite education. What model have you used? You said it's both is important focus. How did you get there, if possible, to say shortly?
And so basically we try to get two variables. Like the one variable is just the share of kids in a country that achieves 400 test score points. And so you've got some countries where this is close to 100%, but some countries where actually, like the poorer countries, where this is much, much fewer. And you've got a second variable, and that's the share of students who achieve 600 points, which means they are rocket scientists. And so now you've got two variables. The one is just defined as the share of kids achieving basic skills, the other one is the share of kids achieving very high skills. And you can take them together in a growth regression where dependent variable is the growth rate, and then you've got the same model as before, but rather than having the average skills, have these two measures. And what we then see is that although you've got a strong program of multicollinearity because these two are highly correlated, it still shows that both of them are positive and statistically significant. That's the basic model. It's pretty simple.
So I think the next hand was here. Libor?
Hello, my name is Libor Dushek. The question is about the relationship between the test scores, years of schooling, and economic growth. This gives a pretty depressive picture for us who work in the university sector, right? Because yes, the test scores are measured quite early in the age of 13, 15 something, right? the differences between countries in years of schooling are to a large extent driven by the differences in what fraction of the population goes to college or university. But then after you control for, after you put simply capture the quality of the primary education, the test scores at this young age, any additional effect of the years of schooling is zero, which means those who go on to the university don't learn anything new that's useful? Or does it mean that simply, again, the years of schooling at university mean nothing, but the actual knowledge learned at the university varies a lot across countries, but you cannot measure that? And if you possibly could do that, these would reappear as additional contributing factor. And then how do you still reconcile this lack of the relationship of the years of schooling and growth with the kind of the micro evidence, which does find pretty strong returns to schooling, typically measured by just years of schooling, by the college premium, taking out all these kind of test scores and ability measures out. Still, econometricians usually fail to find that these returns to schooling are just due to selection. There appears to be something actually learned, and measured by the years of schooling at the university. So.
Yeah, very good point. About the tertiary education, first of all, in the data that we look at least if you look across all the countries and you basically look at the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there is a lot of variation in the share of kids getting primary education, getting secondary education. So it's not just college going or not at that time. So there's some additional variation in there. But on the other hand, your point is totally true, in the sense if you would do that, we did that just for the OECD countries, and then if you basically really or separately add the share of people getting a tertiary education going to college, it actually doesn't enter the model significantly once you've got test score in there. So how do we interpret that? 2 points there. The first thing is, it doesn't really mean that tertiary education is totally irrelevant, but it's actually only irrelevant to the extent that what you've learned early on is the foundation for what you can do later on as well. So to that extent, these two are correlated, and actually only if you that's what professors like to quarrel about, if all these students come to university unprepared, there's no good of it because they cannot learn anything, and that's partly what you see in there as well. But it's also, it's still literally taken, is that, it's not the big driver of economic growth to the extent that we see is the share of college-educated people. Maybe it is true, as you alluded to, that this is because you just look at college degrees or the years of schooling, but you don't differentiate any quality in there. So it could be that if you could measure what people actually have learned there, or you could measure to what extent what they've learned there is relevant for the labor markets, that you could see more there. So if you just look at the average share of people having a college degree, there can be very different subjects in there. There can be the STEM fields, like mechanics, technologians, and there can be history majors and others and any of these may have different value on the labor market, and maybe once you go there, you can see more there. So there's some research, for example, that's showing that, it's a bit old research, but showing that more people getting a technical major means more growth, whereas actually more people going into law actually means reduced growth. So maybe there's something to that in there. How do we reconcile this with the fact that actually at the individual level in most countries you see very strong returns to years of schooling, to college going?
These are batteries. So yeah,
and I've been talking too long. I can do it like this. That's no problem. So I think we actually have a whole appendix in one of the chapters in the book discussing that. I think, the first point is that the extent to which the quality of education differs is much stronger between countries than within a country. There are quality differences, but on average, getting a school degree in one school in this country than in another school in this country will not be as different as between a very other country and this country. Also meaning then that if you get a certain degree in your country, that means more quality content than if you compare it across countries. And there's also something that I actually I had a picture of this in here. Very interesting data set which is called kind of the adult PISA, which is called PIAC. So the OECD in 2011, 2012, within 24 countries actually did representative samples of the adults in each country and tested them and also in basic skills. And there you can do the direct relation between these skills measured as adults and labor market performance. And what we see there is again these strong returns to degrees or to years of schooling, but at the same time also within countries very strong returns to the test scores. So I think there both is relevant.
Okay, so this is unfortunately the last question, and then bilaterally at the refreshment. So Mike.
So I'll do a two-part question. The first issue is what about the role of education inequality, or simply the dispersion of test scores, which you didn't seem to be putting in your models, but you could. So the question would be, do countries with high dispersion of test scores, does that increase, decrease, or have no effect on the role of test scores on economic growth? And then the other thing I was really wondering about how you take into account average schooling. Yeah, you average it across many years, but if you're serious about the role of compounding effects, then 1 year of schooling early on would matter more than increases in schooling at a later date, even if across countries the average years of schooling would be the same. Is it the case, for example, that some of the East Asian countries expanded schooling earlier than in Latin America? Or engaged in other kinds of educational reforms earlier? And so can you expand on the role of timing in reform on your results?
Okay, the distribution, so basically if you would just add like the standard deviation test scores to the model, it wouldn't enter significantly. So usually it doesn't enter significantly there. But what doesn't matter, and that's actually what we try to get more closely into by looking into the micro data, is you can look at the different parts of the distribution by looking at the shares who go across 400 and also across 600. So there is some distributional issue in there, but to the extent that actually both dimensions here matter. But if you like the pure inequality of test scores in the country does not consistently enter these growth models. We played around with that, and that's not there. What you do see, though, is across countries a very strong association between the inequality in test scores and the inequality in incomes. Like if you would take the IELTS data, so all the PIAC data, like if you look across countries, it's quite amazing. It's like 80% of the cross-country variance in the inequality in income, like say the 90s versus 10th percentile difference, can be accounted for by simply the same inequality in test scores in the countries. So again, inequality there is very relevant, but more for inequality than for growth. In terms of timing, are you concerned with like differences between returns to primary, secondary, or tertiary education, or more like what happens over time in the different countries and the latter, I guess?
Yeah, because changes in years of education does not increase gradually. It's there are very sharp movements because of laws on compulsory education.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I can see that. Well, I mean, I think this is a little bit beyond, like ideally you would start to go into strong panel analysis here, looking at 5-year intervals and look at growth rate, but we ignore all that, but just take the long run differences. There's two reasons. I mean, the one thing, there's just not enough data in terms of test scores to do that. But it's also, three reasons actually. It's also not totally clear what exactly the lags would be. Like you would have to have a very fine-grained measures there, which basically means you would have to go into individual level analysis and couldn't growth analysis in this sense. It's also like if you look at growth rate differences, like the big picture is in the cross-section, and any variance in terms of growth rates over time is like minuscule compared to that. It's just that the East Asian countries grew faster all the time and the Latin Americans grew slower. So if you then go into panel analysis, you're basically identifying from something that's pretty much irrelevant in my view. So it would make identification easier, but at a cost that I think I wouldn't be willing to bear. On the other hand, so there have been papers, for example, trying to use these reforms in compulsory schooling laws to see how that affects individual labor market performance. And actually in our paper where we look at the PIAC data, we do exactly that. So we kind of see that actually, you see it works as an instrument in the sense that when countries increase the compulsory schooling law, so more kids are forced to stay in school longer, these adults that were subject to these reforms have significantly higher test scores than the same kids from the same states that within the US that like kind of a few years earlier actually dropped out earlier from school. And we do see that these things, like these changes in test scores actually have an even stronger relation with the labor market earnings than just in the cross-section. So you do see these type of things, but it's a bit hard to do this in terms of macro analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. I will conclude because the time is over. Thank you very much for coming. There will be some refreshment because it was intellectually demanding session. Let me remind you that if you register your email at IDEA, you'll get invitations to events like this and announcement of new studies. And primarily, thanks to Professor Ludger Woessmann from Munich University for sharing his ideas and research here with us. Thank you.